Thank you for coming this afternoon. My name is Val, and I am the former executive director of the Sellery Art League. And this was an exhibition that I had planned, so I was really happy to to have the opportunity to talk to all these amazing artists. And so, thank you for coming. Thank you all for being here. And I have a series of questions that I'm going to ask, and each artist is going to respond, and then we'll have some time at the end if you have questions for them. All right? This is not supposed to be super formal. So if you have a burning question when I'm asking questions, please feel free. You don't have to wait until the end. But just for to keep us on time, we planned this structure. So, are we ready? Mm-hmm. All right. Okay. So the first question that I have for the artists is, and we can go in whichever order, is how did you get into sculpture or 3D work? And Kathleen,
I'd love to go first.
Oh, go first. Go for it.
Okay. So yeah, I was when I started out as an abstract expressionist painter, and when I went to college, I went to UC Berkeley, and at that time, end of the 70s, beginning of the 80s, there was a lot of abstract expressionist painter professors up there, like Elmer Bishop, Joe Brown, George Miyazaki, and Sylvia Lark I also studied with, and yeah, so that was always the way I liked to work. And abstract expressionism is famously like from the inside out.
Very gestural.
Yeah, and you sort of mine your unconscious or your subconscious for forms. And anyway, so after college I did many things, but at a certain point I came back to making my own work, and I picked up doing the abstract expressionist painting. And I did that for about 5 or 6 years. And I feel like one of the things about art is questions, like questioning is how you move your art forward or your art changes. And so you had this body of work, and I questioned it. I said, well, why am I doing it this way, or what am I doing? And one of the questions I asked myself is there something missing here? What's missing? And I was thinking in doing all this inside out work that the outside in part was missing, the external world. And I thought, yeah, I think I'd like to bring the real world, the world of objects and the outside world into my work. And that's kind of how I got into sculpture. So I always used to, wander the streets and walk around. I was born in Oakland, and I walked around the East Bay all the time. And I started to just pick stuff up and bring stuff into the studios, stack it up, put it together, and, found objects. And so,
And that was how I got started.
yeah, and I got into that, and it went from there.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Rose, how did you get started?
Well, I grew up in the ceramics industry, and my parents had a big architectural ceramics firm, and I started off as a baby when they were at UCLA getting their master's degree, crawling through the play studios. And as I got older, I was riding on the kick wheels. And so ceramics was a big part of my early history. And I ran the factory for 10 years when I was older, and then left with my husband, who was a woodworker, and then joined his woodworking for a while. So I have this kind of industrial and commercial background. At some point, my ex-husband, started doing wood carving, and he didn't need my hands. So I was still raising my daughter, and I went back to school and started studying jewelry, which I just fell in love with. I took a class making jewelry, and did that for a number of years, but my jewelry started getting bigger. I kept trying to tell stories with my jewelry. And at one point, Metalsmith magazine had a call for eating utensils, and I used found objects, and I used glue. And I made these eating utensils that gone into this international magazine, but it opened up a world for me that I didn't have to use precious stones and precious metals, and I didn't have to use my torch alone in the dark, you know, with my optic visors on, making jewelry. So that was kind of the beginning of sculpture for me, and it was found objects, and I too pick up things on the street and at a garage sale. And in most of my work, I do try to tell a story, and that's a big impetus for me, is that storytelling that has evolved into sculptural work.
Well, I always dabbled in lots of different things, I think. And then I actually, I went to school and studied behavioral science, psychology, not art. And then I went back to school and I was studying law. So a very circuitous route. And while I was in law school, there was a community art center on campus. And I probably should have been studying law. I took ceramics and watercolor and photography and glass fusing. And I was not the best law student. And then I graduated and I practiced law for a little while. And then after a little while, I was working part-time. I had a child at home, and then I'm like, I still want to do art. And so I took a lot of ceramics classes at community college. And then at some point I decided I didn't want to be a lawyer anymore. I wanted to be an artist. And so ceramics was kind of my thing at that time, but then I thought, oh, well, I want to get my master's. San Jose State was like the closest thing to home, and I couldn't move. I was rooted where I was, and so to get in, I needed to get into their master's program without a previous art degree. So I took a bunch of classes in community college, and I had taken, they're not going to take me with just a billion ceramics classes. So I started taking painting and drawing, and then I took a few painting classes, and the next thing you know, I'm gluing things onto my paintings. Because that 2D world was just not satisfying the 3D edge. And then I also kind of got into this thing about ceramics being kind of annoying because it could break, it can break when it's leather hard, when it's greenware, when it's bone dry, after it's been this, or after it's been sitting on your friend's shelf for 10 years. And then they're, can you make us another one? And they fall off the shelf. And I'm like, all right, then what's the perfect medium? I just decided, what can I do that won't break? And I tried casting and welding, and then I just gravitated to found objects and loved the resonance that they have, a life lived, and welding's fun.
How did you learn to weld? Where did you learn to weld?
Community college. I learned at De Anza College, and then I guess honed it better at San Jose State.
Thank you.
I have a master's degree in Russian history because I walked out of a PhD program and said, this is not for me. I wound up with a job in magazine publishing, so I took some advertising space for consumer magazines when print was still profitable, and got bored with it and then tried to figure out what I was going to do. At the same time, I was introduced to antique jewelry, and I fell in love. I didn't know what I was looking at in showcases, but the pieces were all kind of, some were talking, some were screaming at me. And so the more I learned about antique jewelry, the more I started to think in terms of it as a vehicle for a career change. So as I learned more and more, it became apparent that I didn't have the money to fund becoming a dealer because I wasn't going to buy and sell. So I put other praise and work with other people's goodies. And then I woke up one morning after I'd been pursuing all of this, and I realized that I had no idea how jewelry went together. So how could I look at a supposed 19th century piece and visually take it apart to find out, to figure out, to determine if it's right, if I didn't know how the pieces went together, how the components went together. So I signed up for a night class. We were still in New York at the time. And to have a sense of how metals work and how you would put them together and what design considerations were for something that's wearable to relate to the body. And so in that first semester, I learned that I could solder without burning up the bench, or anybody else near me, and I could saw through sheet metal, without going through rows of saw blades. And at the end of that first semester, the professor gave us a hammerling project. So, take a 4-inch square piece of sheet and just hammer the hell out of it. And what I learned in that exercise was that metal can work and can move in ways that's similar to fiber. And this is something I understood because I grew up sewing. I'd been I did hand stitching, I was on a sewing machine for as long as I can remember. There were yarn dolls, there were stuffed animals, there were all sorts of things. And so that's the point at which metals really stopped. I started to relate to the metal as opposed to it being an intellectual exercise to feed knowledge to become an appraiser. And then fate kind of stepped in. My husband came home from a business conference in Frankfurt with a job offer from one of his clients in San Diego. And so we moved to San Diego, and then I discovered that San Diego State has this phenomenal metalsmithing program. And I had an opportunity to go up to campus and study with Arlene Fish, who literally wrote the book on applying textile techniques to metal. And so while my soldering was not terrific, and I really didn't care about sawing, and I really didn't care about forging, she welcomed me, and that's when I learned that you can weave and you can knit, and I can't knit and I can't crochet. I'm quickly klutz with knitting needles and crochet hooks. But you can weave, you can do basketry. I made lace. And so I came out of a couple of semesters with Arlene with a jewelry business that focused on weaving gold and platinum by hand. And which worked for about 20 years. The cost of my materials started to skyrocket. The cost of gold and platinum just went through the roof, and the business of the business stopped working, and it made me crazy, and we're not going to ask my husband about this part, and more frustrated and more aggravated, and I realized that it was time for another change. And I had been thinking for a long time, let's get bigger, let's get bigger. It's something that I kind of inherited from Arlene. Her pieces were never small and easily wearable. They were always large. And all of my jewelry designs started large, and I always had to scale them down so that they weren't too heavy to make out of gold or platinum, or too costly to make out of gold or platinum. So I started to play with stainless steel and bronze, which turned out to be incredibly liberating, because not only did I no longer have to concern myself with what I was making that didn't have to relate to the body anymore, but I also didn't have to worry about the cost of materials. And while I told myself when I'm working with the gold and the platinum, you can recycle them, you can send them back, you can pull money back, but it wasn't until I was working with the industrial metals, for which I was paying maybe $30 a pound, as opposed to thousands of dollars an ounce, that I realized that I really didn't have to think about the materials or the cost of materials anymore. And that was no longer getting in the way of the creativity of what I thought I could make. And the switch to the industrial metals then also enabled me to revisit one of the techniques that Arlene had introduced in the classroom, which was making lace, which was completely not only impractical, but unrealistic in the precious metals, or even in silver. Silver was much too soft. But it works with stainless steel, and it works with the phosphor bronze, and scaling it up was much, much easier. And so that's how I became a sculptor.
Well, thank you all for, for your answers, and I think one thing that I want to acknowledge, I'm going to sort of acknowledge the obvious, which is, I think sometimes in different careers that we have this perspective that people go into kind of a straight line to get to where they are, and it's so wonderful to hear, all of you, because they're doing our journeys, right? It's never a straight shot, and I also want to appreciate the fact that it sounds like it's all about curiosity. You all got curious about different things, and that, made all these turns on the road, and I really appreciate that. So, thank you. All right, so my next question for you, I need to preface that question with the reason for this show. So I planned this show, I don't know, almost a year ago, when I was still working here in the Art League. And the reason I had seen an exhibition at Radius Gallery of the Pacific Rim Sculptors, and I really loved, the work, and I was like, oh, I want to do something with Pacific Rim Sculptors. And then when we were trying to decide, okay, what's the theme, for this exhibition, I ran a really simple experiment, and I just repeated this experiment this week, which is I asked people, tell me, when you think about sculpture, tell me who's the first artist that comes to mind. And so I did this with a group of friends, and I just did this with a group of students that I was doing a presentation for. And their answers were Michelangelo, Rodin, etc., etc. And I'm like, what does that have in common? They are all men, right? And so it's fascinating to think that, there is a huge cultural sort of like connection between sculpture and men. Lots of, there's in American art, itself has, a huge amount of women sculptors, but the word culturally, it's too very loaded, So that was one of the reasons when I was having conversations with the folks from Pacific Rim Sculptures, and I said, why don't we do, an exhibition that actually focuses on women identifying non-binary, in trans folks that that identify as women, and so that's how the idea for this exhibition came about. Because obviously there's a huge group of very talented people in Pacific Rim Sculptures, so obviously when you're curating an exhibition, you have to kind of think about what's the theme, and so that was something that I was curious about. It's like I want to see their work. So I told you just this long preface to say for this question that I have, for you all, which is, and this can be a yes or no question, which is, does gender or gender identity or gender issues play a role in your work? And whether you're going to say yes or no, tell us why.
So I'm getting back to the questions and questioning. And a friend of mine, back when I was painting, said to me, do you paint in abstract expressionism because you're seeking transcendence? And that was one of the ideas in the canon of modernism, that artists sought transcendence. And I thought, oh, I don't really like that word. That doesn't really seem like what I'm into, but it made me go down a road of philosophy, which is to try to figure out what that concept meant and what the world there was. And so I looked into that myself for a while, and then I got into a reading group, a philosophy reading group with some friends, and we've been reading philosophy for like 5 or 6 years, and it brought kind of like a conceptual focus to abstract sculpture, abstraction in general, is it's very open to interpretation. So you can make something and have the artist can have something in mind, be working with some ideas or whatever, and make something that has a meaning to them. But that doesn't mean that everyone's going to see it and think the same thing. So the piece that I have here is called Suspended Agency, and the reason, the one in the middle here. And so our reading group was reading a book called Ugly Feelings by Cyan Nagai, and she's a kind of a philosopher writer, and she had this concept of suspended agency, which is about how in the modern world, in our contemporary world, we have a hard time, the system is so large and so overwhelming that we just don't, we can't have direct agency, you know? And we're kind of bewildered sometimes by the world around us and our place in the world, our psychology and our sociality. So I made this piece and I called it Suspended Agency, and in my mind it was kind of like being, you know, just one of the things in the book of Ugly Feelings is disgust. And somehow to me this was like, I pull my materials from the street, these paint buckets, and then this clothing that I ripped up, and I make these long, you know, strands that I tie together. And it was kind of like vomiting, you know, like something was being expectorated from this column. And so in my mind, that's what it was about. But in the context of gender and this show, I realized, this kind of, you could interpret this many ways. This could be like menstruation, it could be like birth, it could be like anything where something is being expressed from the body and those, you know, biological imperatives that people who, you know, who call themselves women, you know, deal with in their lives. But gender itself is something that I can't say that I always address, because for me, I kind of avoid gender because it's a social thing, and I don't want the world to tell me who I am,
Sure.
you know. So I just, you know, sort of, for me, it's more of a sort of a fragile embodiment, like a body-oriented, maybe even more biological sense of interest in form. So that's where I'm coming from with this piece, and I feel like it's kind of, you know, it's interesting how things take on different, you know, you can see them in different ways. One person told me that this piece reminded me of a rocket ship that was taking off, you know, and this was like the fire coming out of the bottom or whatever. So you can see a lot of things in an abstract form. Yeah.
Thank you. Rose.
Most of my work is, as I mentioned, I try to tell stories, and most of my work references men, women, relationships, social issues, and I do love when work is open to interpretation, and I hope in what I do that people will bring their own interpretation to them. The pieces I have in this exhibit are in the back. One is the boxing gloves and it's Survivor. It's a continuing story that I've been working on about women in abusive relationships. So it seems pretty obvious to me. And then sperm donor, which we need men. If you want to have a child, you need a man somewhere in there, but you don't necessarily need to go through the normal physical acts to achieve your end. And I've had friends that have used turkey basters, and the male friend in the upstairs bedroom and the other friend bringing the turkey baster down. And here we go, let's make this happen. So in finding an atomizer additive, which is an old like squeeze spray model, at a garage sale one time. It brought that to mind, the turkey baster, baby making. So a lot of my work has playful elements to it and hopefully humorous. Sometimes they're a little darker. I finished a piece recently that was made out of white hangers, and I made a dress out of that, and then suspended dripping red hangers from it to address the Roly Wade in me. And so yes, my work does reference gender and social issues.
Thank you, Rose.
Yeah, mine is very much, I think, about kind of traditional gender roles. I think that comes up a lot in many of the pieces I've made. And part of it has to do with that journey I took to get where I am. That starting out in kind of psychology and then going into law, and I was a public defender, and I was a professional, and the world regarded me in a certain way. The way people would treat me, or and then I had my first child, and I opted to stay home. I was a stay-at-home parent. And then the world treats you differently again. So a lot of it has to do with that transition, going from the professional world and then going into the domestic sphere. And it's like the story that I tell is like I would go to, my ex was also a lawyer, so we'd go to he worked at a firm, and we'd go to a party or something, and I would tell them, even lawyers, but non-lawyers, you tell someone that you're a public defender, that you're a criminal defense attorney, and that is like the most interesting thing in the world, and they have a million questions for you, and of course always, how can you defend guilty people? But there's all this, and then I could go into the same group of people and say, I'm a stay-at-home mom, I'm a primary caretaker, and I think their eyes are going to roll back in their head like you just said the most boring thing ever, and like you couldn't possibly have anything interesting to say when just having this other job, I obviously had lots of interesting, and I'm that same person, right? And then I realized how that was, reflecting back on me and even the way I saw myself. And so a lot of my work kind of taps into that. And then also, admittedly, my marriage was going badly. So a lot of my artwork is kind of venting about that. Fahrenheit 212 is the unhappy homemaker. So, a lot of it's just kind of dealing with those domestic tensions. And then I just one little extra. So I did go to San Jose State and get my MFA in spatial art, sculpture. And now I am the teacher there. And I teach in our foundry facility. So I do teach wood shop and welding. I'm the shop teacher, so I went from lawyer who never touched a tool in her life until her 40s, to now I am in a traditionally very male-dominated space, and I love it. And I love that I get these tiny little girls who are, scared to death to be in that space, and I love thinking, I love being the tiny little person. Because, it's like you don't have to be big to do it. And you don't have to be a man. And we don't, so, and I love helping the students, overcome their fears. And because I think if you can, have that experience of being really afraid of something and then surmounting that, I like to think that they can carry that on to other experiences. And but I will also say I get plenty of young men who are scared to death of that. So it's not just the girls.
Thank you.
I find that gender identity and gender roles really do not play a part in the work. What does what's integral to the work is that I create with techniques that are traditionally considered women's work. The materials that I use are typically considered male. The techniques are typically considered female. And so it's a matter of finding the proper balance, which can be lots of fun and eye-opening, and can be frustrating. I have to be concerned about the physical properties and the working characteristics of the metal. I have to be concerned about structural integrity. How far can I push things? How open can the piece be? And in fact, the lace piece that's here, which the lace itself is 9 inches wide, and I think the piece of lace itself is 5 feet long, and it was made from 28 strands of twisted wire that were probably 15 feet long when I started. And my plan for it was to be an open spiral. It was going to be the largest hanging piece of 17 in a hanging piece, in a ceiling suspended piece. And what I discovered is that bronze is a lot heavier and denser than stainless steel, and the piece would not support the weight of the metal. It just collapsed on itself. And so I had to change the dimensions to create that open spiral for the piece that I was working on, which then left me with this 5 feet of lace that I needed to do something with, at which point I started playing with the material. And so as a kid, I played with material that was silk or corduroy or linen, and now I play with material that I've made, which is metal. And what that translates to in terms of the work and how the work is perceived is, rather than male-female, it raises questions of craft versus art. And that's a whole other discussion that needs magnums of something. So sometimes the work is considered sculpture, and so it's familiar materials that are worked in unfamiliar ways. Or if I've got an audience of fiber artists, then it's known techniques with unfamiliar materials, and so it can be seen in a variety of ways or no way. And that becomes the challenge.
And that hybridity does relate to gender and gender roles, I think. That's what I was thinking about in terms of my piece too, just that, don't you think hybridity in general and just moving across the definitions and the boxes that people put in the category.
And I think that maybe a good scope of this in different kinds of ways, which is often, the fact that you're crafting through your life, that it's often guided by family changes and so on and so forth, creates that kind of flexibility. That kind of hybridity, to use that word. I think I love reading biographies of artists, and I'm always fascinated by, how often male artists live, their journey through their work it's quite linear. It's quite linear, and women's journeys are often like this because of family demands, expectations, life, career changes, etc. And so I would definitely say that it's a fact. It's a fact. I think it's changing. I absolutely think it's changing. This week I was meeting with an artist that came to the meeting with me with his baby in the stroller. And I was so happy to, he asked me, is it okay if I bring my baby? And I'm like, yeah. I was just so excited, that he's a male artist, and and he's getting his MFA, and he's being the caretaker, and I was like, yes. And he's a dancer, and I'm a dancer, so I was even more excited about it. But it's changing, I think that the generation of, to come, I definitely see a change, but I think that for for the longest time, I think that's how it has been. You know what I mean? In women identifying folks, especially I think family, having a family really moves that journey in different directions than one might expect. So, all right, thank you. So awesome to hear all your perspectives. So the last question that I have before we open up to folks, to the audience, if there's any other questions, is what are you working on now, or what is something that you're excited about that you're working on now, and if you have an exhibition coming up, if you want to share where people might be able to see this, whatever you're working on now. It can be online, it can be in a gallery, whatever it is. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, so speaking of life, in my life, something came about in November, which is that my brother died, and I am the executor of his estate. So that takes a lot of time for me to deal with, and then so it's kind of I stopped a little bit in my work. I also have a friend in my studio, one of my studio mates. I have a studio with 3 studios, and he passed away too. So we have, so we have new people a new person coming in, and we're so these things and life changes and things sometimes will take your work will take the back seat for a while, and then you'll get going. So I'm not racing forward on anything, but in the studio we have 3 artists, and we all met because we worked we were in a gallery. It was an artist-run gallery in Oakland. It's called Mercury 20, and so we are not part of the collective anymore, but we're emeritus, people who have been, and so we have a little show in the back room part of the gallery coming up in May, and we're going to work together. We like to make small works. We're going to make a lot of small works and just kind of scatter them all around. And again, the theme is fragile embodiments. So we're making small sculpture and small paintings, and just putting them all together. The 3 artists are going to put them all together, and then kind of scatter them in the room. So that's what we're going to be working. That's what we are working on right now.
And it's going to be at Mercury.
It's going to be at Mercury 20 Gallery, which is in Oakland on 25th Street. It's going to be in May.
All right.
Yeah.
Follow them on Instagram so you can go see it.
Yeah, Mercury 20 is great. It's a great gallery, and it's run by artists, and it has 20 artists. It always has new work all the time.
Awesome. Thank you. Rose, what you been cooking?
What am I cooking? I'm working on, as I mentioned, the dress made out of hangers. It's white, 3-dimensional, life-size, mounted on the wall. It's very open because it's made with hangers, and then it has the straight hangers that represent back alley abortions and the dripping blood. That one is on its way this week to Chicago, to an exhibition there. So if you're in Chicago,
What's probably cool. Where will it be in Chicago?
at the Women Day Gallery in Chicago. I also have work right now as part of the Pacific Rim Sculptures in Sonoma, at the Sonoma Museum, for the Imbalance. Is that the right name? Question of balance. Thank you. Question of balance, and that is a pair of shoes that were made out of wool and wood and ribbons, were made a pattern, and the 2 shoes each meet at the toes seamlessly, so they become a pair, and they're called the union of 2 souls. And from that piece, I'm working on a pair for 2 women, and also not just made working on a pregnant dress that is about choice and to be of our own choosing, whether we as female carry children or not. And that's the continuation of the downfall of Roe v. Wade and our inability to be able to choose for so many women. So that's what I'm working on.
Little light stuff.
Yeah.
So it's, what was the question? What are we working on? Where is
Where
it?
do you see your stuff?
Well, I'm also in a question of balance. I have a piece there.
Yeah, we're all.
Thank God someone remembered the name.
So the piece I have in that exhibition is a very recently completed piece. It's an old stool that I saved from the dumpster that was broken and very beat up from the foundry facility where I work. And I took a bunch of furniture that I cut into little pieces, and I kind of stacked them up, and they kind of go a little off kilter to one side as they step up. So these, kind of little bits of home. And then on the top, there's an eggshell, which I used a real eggshell, but I had to reinforce it with a little aqua resin because I found that eggshells are super fragile. It was right.
Porcelain ceramics.
And on top of the eggshell and next to it, I've got two little bronze houses. So it's the house on the hill. And again, thinking kind of about domestic relationships, but also hard not to think about housing and where it is now, the expense and who has it and who doesn't, and kind of, this is the privileged home on top of the hill, but of course the egg is a very fragile hill to be on. So that's in a question of balance. I'm also in an exhibition in Orange County right now at the Berke Gallery, and I have 5 pieces in a show called Through the Dream House. So that one was like right up my alley. And I have a few more kind of these welded silverware pieces. I have an exploding sink. I have a pot that's splashing out. And I have some silverware, a wall piece with a couple of cups that kind of like splashing out. And then I have a couple of totems. One of them is it's about 11 feet tall, and it starts out as a laundry basket on the floor, and there's some folded laundry and then not folded in the basket. And then up, rising out, is this totem of laundry detergent and pots and pans and rags. And it goes up and up and up, and at the very top is the chair where you get to rest when you're done with all your chores. And then I have another one, which is just this mass of stuffed animals that I've collected from all kinds. A lot of things in my art come from my own home. I was the keeper of the one who was supposed to, take all the stuff to Goodwill. And as the marriage became more and more dysfunctional, I would say, that mass of stuff to go to Goodwill just grew and grew. And then I'm like, oh, this is going into these are my art materials. And then I needed more, so I just, next door is great. I need stuffed animals if your kid is gone. So it's this huge, this one's about 9 feet tall, and at the top is this chair that I found at a garage sale that's really, it's like gold, and the seat is, that red kind of velveteen, and it's the Queen's throne. So that's what I have on exhibit right now. And I guess right now I'm working on a piece, a cast bronze piece, and I'm making a kind of a crown of thorns, but I'm putting my vines have Legos. So it's going to be Legos and vines and thorns, and a wearable.
Tiara.
Yes.
So the piece that I have that, in a question of balance, is 7 bronze lace elements that are suspended from the ceiling. And what I'm working on now is on exploring new geometries. So all of the work to date is made out of ribbons, essentially out of rectangles, and with loose wire ends at the beginning or at the end. I get to play with them. And what I've been playing with now is crescents, crescent shapes, moon shapes of different lengths and different widths. And I can make those out of thinner wire and then stitch them to an armature. And so what that means is that the armature will support the lace. The lace itself doesn't have to be self-supporting, nor does it have to curl back on itself and be stitched together to support itself, which is what you see in the piece here. And so with that, with the new geometry comes the opportunity for more open pieces and for larger scale. Playtime in the studio.